Hello. Thank you, everybody, for joining us and for coming back after the break. So this panel will focus on Chicago's current response to gun possession and trends in prosecuting gun cases. And I think we can we have some slides for you to show you guys to start with. So our panelists are, sure I pronounce everyone's names correctly. So we've got Sharone Mitchell, the public defender of Cook County. Thank you so much, Sharone, for joining us. We've got Stephanie Kollmann of the Policy Director of the Children and Family Justice Center here at the Bluhm Legal Clinic. Sheila Bedi, who is the Clinical Research Professor of Law and Director of Community Justice at the Bluhm Legal Clinic as well. And Jasmin Aramburu, who's a research associate at the Child and Family Justice Center, also at the Legal Clinic. And so Jasmin, if you could start us off, I believe you have some slides to show us, and if you could talk a little bit about what are some of the trends, the recent trends in gun possession cases, and how are they treated by the local criminal legal system?
Absolutely. Thank you, everyone, for coming, and thank you, Maya, for starting us off. So I want to talk a little bit about gun possession trends in Chicago, Cook County, and the state of Illinois more generally. So let's start off by talking about gun possession arrests. As we see in this charge provided by the Cook County State's Attorney's Office, gun arrests have increased over the past several years. One thing to point out that although arrests have increased, gun violence has not necessarily improved. When you compare the Chicago Police Department to other Cook County law enforcement jurisdictions, you see that the increase in arrests have been primarily driven by CPD. And while both CPD and non-CPD law enforcement agencies have increased their gun arrests for specifically nonviolent gun arrests, you see that when it comes to violent gun arrests, the rate at which these are being conducted has remained relatively flat for non-CPD, and for CPD, it has actually decreased. And something important to know also is that the clearance rate for shootings for the Chicago Police Department has been historically low and continues to be that way. So what is driving these new gun arrests? So specifically, there has been an increase in nonviolent, people with no prior convictions gun arrests, and this is primarily done via vehicle traffic street stops. If you see the chart here, it gives you some notion of the uptick in increases in gun arrests over the past couple of years. When we talk about pretrial release, we see that people who are on EM or electronic monitoring, over 45% of these individuals in Cook County have as their highest charge a gun possession allegation that did not harm anyone. So this is over 3,700 individuals in Cook County. A study that was published by Loyola last year, examining bond reform in Cook County that was implemented in 2017, found that defendants who were released on bond for weapons-related possession were no more likely than others defendants to be rearrested for violence, one, and two, they were less likely than other defendants on bond to have a failure to reappear in court. And not only do we see this in Cook County, but we also see this in other counties across the state of Illinois. Arrests, again, for illegal gun possession only constitute an increasing amount of arrests compared to those, for example, that have gun possession with additional charges. So if you look at the graph provided here, it's maybe hard to see the colors, but the gray line, which is the one that is above all the others, represents the percentage of only possession charges. And when looking at data from 5 years, 2014 through 2009, we see that arrests for those without prior convictions for any crime increased up to 90%, while those with prior convictions increased to 54%. I think that there's a continuous message from law enforcement, from media, that there is an increase in guns confiscated every year. And when we look at the data, we see that up until 2017, the rate at which guns were recovered remained pretty stable. The rate was pretty flat, seizing just below 7,000 guns per year. However, starting around 2017, you see that uptick in guns confiscated. And recent analysis show that from last year to this year up to now, there's been an increase in about 19% of gun seizures. But I want to point out that although gun seizures have been occurring, or the number of gun seizures have increased, this doesn't necessarily translate into a decrease in gun violence. Something that I think is really interesting that really we want to touch on are how are these guns being recovered? The methods, the ways through which guns are recovered disproportionately impact communities of color. So gun possession charges usually begin with searches of cars, so vehicles, homes, or on a person, on a body. And based on data from 2017, for Illinois traffic stop data, we see that 85% of CPD traffic stops were with people of color. CPD was 2.7 times more likely to ask to search vehicles for Black and Latinx drivers. And something that's even more interesting is that searches on people's bodies, on people's homes, are especially more traumatic and racially disproportionate. So about 95% of CPD body pat-downs reports were of people of color, and similarly, 96% of CPD search warrants targeted people of color. And so how does Cook County compare to the rest of Illinois? So over the years, Illinois has increased or passed legislation that was more punitive for gun possession. And although this was passed in Illinois, it has disproportionately impacted Cook County, and specifically Black men in Cook County. So 76% of all Class 4 firearm possession felony convictions in Illinois, and Class 4, just to give context, is the lower level offense, a lot of times first-time gun offenders, occurred in Cook County specifically, 62% in Chicago, and statewide, from these convictions in Illinois, they stemmed from 11 specific neighborhoods in the city of Chicago, and this 1/3, I think, really represents how concentrated policing is and has been and continues to be in disenfranchised communities. And of these Class 4 firearm possession felony convictions, 74% were Black men. And just to drive the point home here in this, for this information, 52% of defendants, so more than those outside of Cook County, 52% of defendants in Cook County were sentenced to prison, compared to 29% in the rest of the state. And this information can be found via Loyola, who so kindly published a report this summer. And another thing to point out when we talk about gun possession trends, and just largely in, I think, gun violence dialogue or gun possession dialogue, there's a fear that if you don't imprison someone for possessing a gun, that later on they will commit a crime, and specifically a violent crime, using that gun. And what we find, though, is that prison does not necessarily reduce the likelihood of violent crime rearrest. Going back to the bail reform that was implemented in 2017, we found that people released pretrial for weapons offenses in Cook County between 2017 through early of this year were at least as likely to be successful, and this means not rearrested, as people released, for example, for property offenses. In the state of Illinois more generally, about 93% of those released after serving their firearm or possession-related sentence were not rearrested within 3 years for violent crime with a firearm. And last but not least, something important to point out is that the majority of those convicted of that lower level offense for firearm possession in Cook County, whether they were sentenced to probation or to prison, the majority were not arrested, again, for a violent crime within 3 years of their sentencing. Specifically, approximately 26% were arrested. And this just to drive home that sentencing to prison did not necessarily provide more favorable results than sentencing, for example, to probation, and overall lowering that rate of recidivism. I have in terms of the slides.
Great, thank you so much. So if I'm understanding the data correctly, it seems that a lot of people are being arrested for possession. There are a lot of arrests for possession of guns, but just contrary to what the superintendent of the police department constantly talks about, there actually isn't that much arrest happening for pulling the trigger. So this is like a contrast in the data that I've heard other officials in the city and the county talk about. So I'm just wondering if we could get a little bit more of like a qualitative description of what some of these typical gun arrests and gun cases look like, who's getting arrested, and how these cases shake out. And maybe Sharone, you could speak on that. What are these, once the cases hit the court, what do these cases actually look like?
Thank you all so much for inviting me to Harry Potter's home. My name is Sharone Mitchell Jr., Cook County Public Defender. We represent the vast majority of people who were charged with felonies, our attorneys. I'm here on behalf of them. And our whole office, 645 freedom fighters, folks fighting for freedom. And I thank them for waking up every day and fighting in the middle of a pandemic for people's freedom. When we talk about these cases, there's a growing amount of cases that result from car stops, right? So we see CPD pulling folks over. As the data that was just presented, it happens in a concentrated area. There were a lot of stats that were thrown out there. All of those stats were great. One of the stats that I continue to think about is that 33% of possession cases in the state, class 4 possession cases in the state, come from 11 neighborhoods in the city. 33%, entire state, come from 11 neighborhoods in the city. Neighborhoods that I'm from. So what we see is lots of people in cars. We see lots of wild goose chases. We see pulling people out of cars and searching cars and demanding things. And I think what what we're told, I think the presumption is that, there are people out there, acting crazy on corners and things of that nature. There's no doubt that we have a harm problem in our communities. And there are ways to resolve those harm problems. So hopefully we can talk about those ways, and we talked about that in the past panel. But these cases look a lot like CPD pulling people over, shaking folks down, finding guns, and putting cases on people. And as we know, the system really, really, really tries hard to not get to a trial. They are doing all that they can to force pleas, right? We sometimes get the opportunity to file Fourth Amendment motions, and many times we're successful. on those motions. I think there's about a 80% prosecution rate when it comes to UUWs, but of that 20%, the majority of those, the way those cases go away, not guilties and Fourth Amendment motions. But to answer your question, there's a significant amount of cases that come out of car stops. So go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, sorry, this is kind of a weird setup, so we can't see each other. But
Yeah.
so, what
Hi.
kind of folks are being stopped? Are we talking about like young men with no priors getting arrested with like a semi-automatic pistol? Are we talking about like middle-aged women, with like a gun in their purse? Are we talking about people who already have a background and that's part of why they're getting arrested for possession? Like who are the clients?
Yeah.
What do those cases look
Yeah,
like?
the Public Defender's Office represents in a non-pandemic year, about 100,000 cases overall, which is a wild number that we do that much incarceration and trying to incarcerate people. But that's for another day. So I hate to generalize. Now we know that about 75% of class 4s are children, folks 18 to 24. But there is a growing diversity in types of cases. Unfortunately, I don't have the opportunity to be in the courtroom anymore, but I talk to a lot of folks that are, and we hear quite horrible stories. I'll tell the story of a young man who was stopped on the street. He had a FOID card. That is a card that allows somebody to possess, but he did not have a CCL card. That's a concealed carry license. And he was stopped, and they found the gun, and he was arrested for a felony. And as the state was prosecuting him, and as we were trying to defend him, we learned that he had been shot in 2019, and that the same prosecuting authority that was prosecuting his UUW, his unlawful use of a weapon case, they were also calling him as a witness to testify or give a victim impact statement for his own shooting. He was shot. So, Mr. Andre from our office talked about this, and I think it's so important to talk about this division between, quote unquote, and I hate to use this word, I'll never use it, willingly offender, right, and victim. Folks want to paint this idea that there are bad people and there are good people, and the bad people have the guns, and they need to protect, the good people need to be protected. In the end, I think you see a lot of folks that are just in conflict and struggle and are looking to protect themselves. And that's a great example of how somebody who they're trying to prosecute is also a victim, and they're also asking him to proceed in the prosecution of another person. But it's a common story.
Thank you. So, Sheila, I'd love to hear from you about how these trends connect to kind of a broader history and a broader way in which Chicago-style policing and Chicago Police Department contribute to the city's gun problem and to the need that some people might feel to even carry a gun in the first place. I mean, there's kind of a tendency in local academic circles that I've noticed that a lot of times the people that are producing the data about gun violence and gun crimes are not linking, the police to as part of the problem. So I'm curious if you've observed if you've observed these connections in your work, and can you talk a little bit about how the way we police connects to the gun problem that we observe on the streets?
Thank you. Thank you so much for the question, and thank you, all of you, for being here. So I really appreciate the framing of the question, because I do think that when we talk about violence, we are so often assuming that the violence that we're talking about is intercommunal, and we're not recognizing the role that the state has in perpetuating violence. And if we look at the history of the Chicago Police Department, we can really plot along a timeline of over 100 years a serious incidence of state violence. We can go back to 1919, when after a young black teenager tried to integrate a beach on the south side, Chicago police officers joined white Chicagoans in beating black protesters. We can fast forward to, as Kofi talked about, the surveillance of the Black Panthers and the ultimate assassination of Chairman Fred Hampton. We can point to the torture scandal of the Chicago Police Department, where for decades police officers were torturing confessions out of Black men on the South Side. The fact that it is widely known that the Chicago Police Department has produced the false confession capital of the world. There are also far more pedantic abuses that don't necessarily make headlines. The kinds of abuses that are implicit in the data, some of the abuses that Sharone alluded to, the unlawful stops and frisks, people who are getting stopped by the police, thrown up against the side of a car, getting roughed up, then going about their lives. These are all forms of state violence, and these forms of state violence really characterize, mark, define the interaction that so many of our community members have with the Chicago Police Department. And because we have not yet created alternative forms of community safety, because someone who has experienced harm does not yet have, throughout the city, a restorative justice process to go to, the police department is the only game in town when somebody is hurt. They're still the only institution that we have. And when the institution that you are supposed to go to when you are harmed produces so much harm, it is not surprising that people feel like they have to seek out their own forms of justice, because the department has been proven again and again throughout history that it is racist, lawless, corrupt. And you don't have to take my word for it. These are findings. I'm quoting from findings from the US Department of Justice. The other thing that we've seen in police departments across the country is that those departments that are most corrupt, that have the highest rates of use of force and community violence, are also among the departments that have the lowest closure rates, that have the most difficulty solving crimes. There's a very clear connection there. And if you buy into the idea that the way we get safe is by solving crimes, prosecuting people, footnote, I don't buy into that idea, but I know some do. But if you accept that, and then you realize that these high rates of violence from the police department are really interrupting the ability to solve crimes, interrupting the ability for people who are surviving intercommunal violence to get the only form of justice that the system provides. So there's an intimate connection between the violence that is endemic to the Chicago Police Department and the community harm that we see.
Thanks. And I'm wondering, too, you're intimately involved in the consent decree process. You represented some of the community groups who sued the city over police violence and patterns and practices of civil rights abuse. And that lawsuit eventually led to this consent decree, which the police department is not doing a very great job with complying. And I'm just wondering if you're hearing is the police department using gun crime or, their kind of statistics about possession and all of these things as an excuse in any way to justify their noncompliance with the consent decree? Are you hearing that kind of thing?
What we're hearing from the police department to justify the slow compliance with the consent decree, and the consent decree is a federal court order that requires changes to the police department from use of force to accountability. And essentially the police department has failed to comport with the requirements of that consent decree. And what we're hearing is that one of the reasons for the failure is because police resources are taxed, because the pandemic, the uprisings put a lot of pressure on the police department, and because the police department is having to find, quote, innovative solutions to respond to the epidemic of gun violence. So the narrative of communities in chaos is certainly one of the things that the department uses to suggest that it cannot police effectively if it also does so constitutionally. Of course, that's not true. The police departments are required to police constitutionally, but one of the things that we're hearing is that there's significant delays in policy development and training in the things that are required in order to meet the demands of the consent decree, and that those delays are because of the demands on the police department from these external factors.
Very interesting and sadly unsurprising. So Stephanie, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how Chicago compares to other jurisdictions like, how does Chicago's approach to gun possession compare to that in other states, other big cities, and what are some of the drawbacks of the approach that has been taken here in Chicago?
Thank you for the question. I think the first step that we have to look at when we're assessing whether what we're doing here is working at all, and how it might compare to what's happening in other cities, other states, certainly other countries, is to question what it is that we think we're achieving, especially when we are pursuing gun possession solely as though it were a violent crime. And we're pursuing it, we meaning the city of Chicago and its police department. Policing, as has been described, yes, but then what happens in court? So in Illinois, these are all felony charges, and they're not expungible. They're lifelong felonies for people who possess a weapon, even if it's unloaded. If they have no Foid card, it's a felony. And you can't ever get rid of that. Then Illinois has long mandatory sentences of incarceration for most weapons possession offenses. It also calls them things that sound different, right? They sound like very violent offenses. Oftentimes they're not. The other thing that happens
Can
in
you just
Illinois...
say what an example is of how that sounds?
Well, there's a term called armed violence that sounds very clear, right? That's the act of having a gun, whether it's lawfully possessed or not, and also committing any other felony. So if you had, for instance, a personal use amount of cocaine and a handgun that you lawfully owned, under this code, it would be called armed violence in the state of Illinois. And I think that what these laws have done is demonize huge swaths of the city in a way that simply isn't done in most of America. Kofi talked about in the first panel about how American culture is gun culture. These are not necessarily laws in other states that are emulable in terms of their encouragement of people to possess guns, which is an inherently dangerous enterprise. But what is true is that in almost every other state in the union, people are not penalized in the same ways that we do in the state of Illinois. We are more punitive in the degree of our felonization and the degree of our incarceration than almost every other state in the nation. And certainly in the region, there are no other states in our area that require prison sentences for gun possession. It's just simply not done. And the fact that the way that this is discussed in this city, as though there's something that inherently wrong happening if people who are still receiving felonies are let out pre-trial or are receiving probation for a nonviolent possession offense, that something is broken in the city of Chicago. By the way, the city of Chicago, which is already producing sentences, as we heard from Jasmin's data, that are more punitive than in the rest of the state, right? So Cook County is more punitive than the rest of the state. The state is more punitive than the rest of the region. America is more punitive in many respects than the rest of the world. We are sitting at the epicenter of a very harsh response to what is, for people who are white and have no felony conviction and have the appropriate permits, considered freedom and a right that is inherent. And I think questioning what it is that we think we're doing when we issue not only prison sentences. We heard that many people are carrying because of trauma. I ask you what a strip search in a prison is. We are re-traumatizing people. But then also, we are giving them these lifelong ways to be locked out of the economy. A lot of people are carrying guns because they're engaged in a cash business and they need to protect that cash. If you're locked out of the lawful economy after your felony conviction for carrying a gun, where does that stop?
Yeah, and actually, this is a great segue to the next question I was going to ask Sharone. How does a person's life get impacted? Like, what does a person's life trajectory look like after they get, those gun charges, especially in the beginning, their first charges, even if it's like a simple possession? What kind of impact do you see on your clients' lives after these charges come down? And actually, could you also say, like, what it would be like with or without a conviction?
It sucks, technically. So let me try to answer that. Let me just add on one more thing that Stephanie said. These naming conventions are wild. Like, think about being a defense attorney, and the person is charged with armed habitual criminal. How are you going to defend that case? That's an actual charge, armed habitual criminal, right? How do we actually give that person a fair shot? Unlawful use of a weapon, right? Word use. What does use mean? Look it up in the dictionary. It mean you just possessed it, right? And imagine looking at somebody's background and you see unlawful use of a weapon, right? And you turn on the news and the first 14 to 17 stories are about how people are shot and people are killed, right? Yeah, even though it happens thousands and thousands of times, there are no stories about somebody being held accountable, right? Going to prison, even though we send the people to prison all the time for guns, right? Imagine how that person's life is gonna lead when they have that against them. You know, I think about another. I don't have a lot of war stories, but I like narratives. In answer to this question, I think about an individual that I represented, who I actually knew from high school. Funny enough, small city, and he was one of the dudes that made it. He actually he lived out of state, and he worked in a different state where he illegally possessed a gun, but in this state it was illegal because of like paperwork. And he was trying to go to Castaways, a bar in a park, and they searched his bag. He gave him his bag, and they found a gun, and he was charged with a UUW. Before we even got to trial, right? We had a trial, right? The state did all they could to get him to plead guilty, right? They threw everything they could at him to get him to plead guilty, because that's like what we do with basically every case. Before we even got to trial, he lost his job, he lost his home. There was a story on the internet printed about him, about his arrest, because that's all we really see, with a few exceptions, of reporting about, quote unquote harm or crime, right? Every time you searched his name, this story came up. And guess what? Not because I'm good at all, because I had good partners and a good jury, he was found not guilty. But all those harms happened. So just the accusation, right, ruined his life. He got back on his feet, but only through straight will, conviction, and just being an incredible human being. Most people won't have that opportunity. So I think these things ruin people's lives. There's a reason why my community doesn't have the vitality that it should have, that it deserves, that it is earned. And that is because we have a system that is much more dedicated to seeming like they're being tough on harm, because crime is a construct, of harm, than actually being effective at stopping harm. So I think for the most part, this approach ruins communities, it ruins people's lives, and it doesn't make my mother's life safer, it doesn't make my life safer, it doesn't make my sister's life safer. It actually makes it less safe.
Well, yeah, this is, it's fascinating how that simple misapplication of a word like use, when the situation is that a person just has something, can really have these tremendous impacts on someone's life. I'm wondering if we could talk a little bit about what the current city administration is doing. And, I think that oftentimes part of the problem to get to some solutions on all of these issues is that actually the responsible parties on a policy level are extremely disconnected and bifurcated from each other. So we've got like the policing that's done by the city, the prosecution that's done by the county, the laws that are made by state officials, and they're accountable to different constituencies, and they're not mutually dependent on each other for a budget necessarily. So it's all kind of disconnected, and it's really easy to pass the blame around. But just to kind of focus on the city for a second, and I'm curious your thoughts about this, Sheila. What can you say about the current city administration's approach to dealing with gun violence and gun crimes in general. I feel like there's a lot of talk about blaming gangs on this issue, and there's kind of been an uptick in referring to gangs as the driving reason why we've had an uptick in shootings. So I'm just curious to hear your thoughts, and anybody here, please jump in as well.
Sure, I have some thoughts.
Do you?
Okay. You've heard some of them.
I don't know about that.
So it's actually not a laughing matter. I mean, I think we're laughing to keep from crying. There is, I think, little question that this administration's approach to harm reduction in our communities and harm reduction from the Chicago Police Department has been much more focused on kind of sound bites and headlines than it is about actually saving lives. And I think there's a couple of really concrete examples of that. The first one is the budget for the Chicago Police Department, which last year was $1.7 billion. When every other major city in the entire country reduced spending on policing in response to the demands of the 2020 uprisings, not the city of Chicago. And that was an intentional political choice. And it was an intentional political choice that ignores the research about what keeps us safer, what makes communities safe. It is not investments in police, it is investments in things, in institutions that are truly life-giving, things like education, mental health services, economic development, positive places for young people to gather. Those are the investments we need if we were really serious about redressing community-based harm. And those are the kinds of investments that this administration has significantly underfunded. And then there is another very recent policy proposal that the mayor has put out that would allow the city attorneys to file civil lawsuits against people that it deems engaging in gang activity, with the idea that the city would be able to recover from these individuals the cost of policing, the cost of prosecuting them, with, again, perpetuating this idea that violence in our communities is because of gang leaders that are just bad people, instead of recognizing how much our intercommunal harm is about systemic, historic divestment. The idea for this ordinance that would allow these civil lawsuits is something that the mayor explicitly has talked about as another quill in her toolbox. I'm mixing my metaphors, but it's another tool that she's going to use to try to stop crime. The reality is there is no data that suggests that filing civil lawsuits against people who are perceived to be gang members is going to make us safer. The best thing we can predict from this proposal is that it will result in divesting more resources from Black and Brown communities, which is the last thing we need for community safety. So those are just a few of my thoughts on this administration's approach.
This sounds very similar to like the way civil asset forfeiture functions in as part of the war on drugs and in narcotics cases, where basically somebody's family's car, money, whatever else may be seized just because it may have been involved in some narcotics-related crime. Is this like this? Are they trying to use a similar model for this?
Yes, I think so. I always, I'm not the deepest thinker, but I think that serious problems deserve serious solutions, right? Serious problems deserve serious solutions. And this solution, unfortunately, is not serious. I laugh and stop from crying. You're right. It's not. It's a serious situation. I come from the city. I know this city. It pains me the harm this city is going through. Right. But to use that harm to justify things that we know won't work, I think is deplorable. But more than that, if it were just ineffective, I think that'd be okay, right? There are lots of bad ideas, right, that go through through folks, right? But the idea that we're promoting things that would actually make things worse, that would actually inhibit our ability to keep our community safer, I think is what's really, really, really shameful. And this idea that we can just it's the problem is so big, let's just throw everything at it without having the conception that things could get worse, that you can make poor communities poorer, that you can make relations between the police and communities, if you believe that's the way to do it, that you can make those relations worse. You can. And when you talk to individuals who are doing the hard work, who are actually on the street pulling kids and young men off the street, and they're telling you that this is going to make our jobs harder, the folks that actually have been proven to be effective, right? Because while there isn't a lot of evidence that spending 96% of the region's money on police and prisons and prosecutions and probation, there isn't a lot of evidence that using 96% of our region's funds on that is effective. There is a lot of evidence, and I think you're going to hear from some people after this panel that have the evidence that what they're doing works. And to ignore those folks for clicks when folks are dying, tough.
Well, the city can, spend as much money as they want on policing. The mayor can drive the police department to make as many arrests. But in the end, they need the state's attorney's office to be cooperative in building these cases and actually prosecuting people and getting those, criminal legal results that they're seeking and that they're saying that they stand for. What are you seeing in terms of the state's attorney's response? We supposedly have this progressive prosecutor now. Have you observed any change in approach to prosecuting gun crimes in the last few years? Curious how that stacks up with the other trends that have been presented. And whoever has an answer, I'd love to hear it.
So I'll say this, and I'll be quiet. I promise. That's the last thing I'll say. Probably not. I'm lying. It's cap. There is a difference, right? I think that this administration has given her assistants a bit more flexibility to make decisions on the ground level, and I think that there is certainly we've seen improvements in equity and justice, and certainly on the policy side, this prosecutor's office has supported many policies that we think will move the legal system a bit further. But prosecutors still going to prosecute. And I think one of the individuals from the last panel talked about how this space right now, gun possession, mass incarceration is kind of a controversial term, but this is the driver of mass incarceration, like possession of gun. This is our new war on drugs. That Loyola study that was just previously cited was a great study, and from that study, another interesting nugget. Between 2014 and 2019, prison admissions for gun possession increased 27%. So prison admissions, 27% for gun possession. All other accusations, crimes, charges, whatever you want to call it, fell 38%. Everything else fell 38% because we're getting away from, other kind of means. But possession went up 27%. So while we have, I think, a great prosecutor on the policy front who's saying a lot of the right things and supporting us in a lot of the right ways to change this legal system, the prosecutor can't be the point guard. And what we're seeing is that we are still doing things that rely on a broken model for safety. So there are improvements, but we can do so much more. And it just can't come out the prosecutor's office. It has to be communities, listening to young people, demand what they need to be safe.
Stephanie, are you seeing anything in your research on this?
I think there's an article that we assign almost every semester that I work with students called Guns and Drugs. It's very easy to remember. And it extends this metaphor that Sharone used farther. It talks about how there's two reasons that these case numbers are going up. maybe 3. We'll say 2. One is the incredible influx of handguns and the changing culture around that. That's just, since 2016 in particular, it has gone up. You saw on Jasmin's chart just astronomically. There was a lot of discussion about how we had an unprecedented violent spike, and in response, people armed themselves like they never had before. Also, concealed carry was newly licensed in Illinois, and so there was this urge and just gun grabbing in the state of Illinois. But, you know, thinking about how these cases start again, the city of Chicago gets up every year and they have a press conference and they say how many guns they seized each year. And when you hear that they mentioned that they took 10,000 guns off the street of Chicago one year, people think to themselves, they're getting the illegal weapons off the street. But I want you to put this number in perspective for a moment. In Illinois, in July of this year, 50,000 handguns were sold. That's 1 month of the year, 50,000. The Chicago Police Department is taking off 10, 13, 15, 20,000 guns a year off the street. We're not taking guns off the street. We're increasing the number of guns on the street in Chicago every year. This is not a sane way to make an actual policy reduction. So why does the system keep using this as their primary tool? And the answer is that it's easy. It is easy to prosecute a contraband case compared to a violent case. It's easy to investigate. It's an A-B switch. A person has a piece of contraband or they don't. They have a license or they don't. You can get a conviction if, as long as the police do their job constitutionally, it's very clear, right? This is an easy case to win. So what could change that? We could change our laws, right? We could change our practices. We could change what we ask the police to do in communities. One huge place of power is the prosecutor's office, because these are not only felonies, but they carry mandatory minimums. You know, these were put in decades ago. People said that they would reduce racial disparities at the time. This was not believed by many, but it was a claim that was made that by taking judicial discretion away, we would decrease the amount of racism that was happening at sentencing. And in fact, what we've done is hide it so successfully that it is almost impossible to challenge. These decisions are being made in the dead of night, on the street. The police officer has full discretion not to arrest somebody who has a gun unlawfully. In the courtroom, the prosecutor has complete discretion not to charge someone with a felony. But once it gets before the judge, the only point in the story where the other side gets a voice, right, where the person themselves gets an advocate from Sharone's office to say, no, you don't understand why this happened. At that point, all the incentives change, and the judge can't do anything functionally about the sentence because the charging decision has already made. So what do we need? We need prosecutors who reject the job that the media is trying to give them of going after every single gun possession case as though it were a violent offense. When you hear the numbers that 10,000 guns are taken off the street, and then you hear the number that several thousand people are shot, it seems like it's a 1-to-1 ratio, but if you acknowledge what no one wants to acknowledge, that there are probably, conservatively, over 500,000 guns in the city of Chicago, you get to understand. And when you think about the concentration of felony convictions that ensure that people will never be able to get a lawful gun license, why do we allow people to carry weapons for self-defense if the people who are most at risk of being shot are never able to get a license that permits them to protect themselves? Now, the research says that it won't actually protect you. You know, you are at greater risk of being shot if you are carrying a gun. We can debate whether that research is talking about this subset of people who are most at risk or not. We don't know enough. But just theoretically, if the reason that anyone is allowed to carry or possess a gun in this country is to protect themselves, but the people who most need that protection are shut out of it permanently and then criminalized further, it doesn't make a lot of sense to me.
Actually, we just got a question from the audience that connects with what you're saying about being able to have a gun legally. So the question is that the panelists have mentioned that FOID cards in Illinois are like the mechanism for legal gun possession, and then separately from that, if you want to take your gun outside, you have to have a concealed carry permit. But so the person is asking. Can you discuss the process of granting or rejecting these FOID cards? Is it a subjective or objective process? If anyone here knows about how one goes about getting an FOID card and what the barriers are to that, that's what the question comes down to.
I'm pretty sure that it is binary on Foid cards. They're issued by the Illinois State Police. You don't have to have any particular kind of training. The license fee is not a large amount. It's very different than concealed carry, which can cost you, 2 days of work and several $100s in order to get a license that would let you have, for instance, a gun in your vehicle. But to have one in your home, to purchase one from a store, the barriers are lower. There are ways that law enforcement can object. I'm not quite sure about the most recent constitutionality of law enforcement objections to Foid cards and concealed carry. I know that in the past, the Cook County Sheriff had objected to every single person who was listed in a gang database being able to have a Foid card. Now, again, you can't get a Foid card for the rest of your life in Illinois if you have a felony conviction. So these are people who've not been convicted of a crime that would prohibit them from having a gun, but because law enforcement has put them in a database by the hundreds of thousands, those license applications were objected to. I think that may have shifted with some legal challenges, but I'm actually not sure.
I can just
Yeah.
briefly add a little bit about the gang database piece. So the Chicago Police Department maintains a gang database that the Inspector General of the City of Chicago found was rife with errors and that it was disproportionately racist as well. People were being put into the gang database merely because they were being pulled over in a neighborhood that a Chicago police officer deemed was gang affiliated. 10% of the black people in the city of Chicago were in this database. You do not have to be convicted of a crime. You don't have to be arrested. A police officer merely has to perceive you as a gang member to be inside of the database. If you are in the database, you will be denied a Foid card. Myself and my colleague Vanessa Del Valle represent a number of people who had that experience, and people who would have had an important perspective to have careers like probation officer, for example, but aren't able to do that kind of work because the Chicago Police Department, without any due process, without any proof at all, labeled these folks as a gang member. So it's an incredibly significant barrier to getting Foid cards for a number of people who have the right and the desire to carry.
And Sharone, do you hear from your clients that, they would want to have a FOID card, but these barriers are in the way and it's impossible to get? Is that something that you encounter with your clients in these possession cases?
Again, we have lots and lots of folks that we represent, but in conversations I actually have with folks that are in the courtroom, and actually conversations with folks I have who I just grew up with, who are my friends, yes, it's a significant barrier, and we're hearing more stories and more stories of people who have FOID cards, but then are arrested because they don't have a CCL, right? So we've deemed that they have certain criteria to possess a gun, but then we charge them with a felony because they didn't have the proper paperwork, right? Or they didn't pay the state their necessary amount of money, or the government the necessary amount of money. So yeah, we see that, and it's funny that Sheila talks about this work. I've got a friend who is a union plumber, right? That tries to provide for his family, lives in a community that has seen elevated rates of violence. He turns on the TV every day and he hears 14 stories a day about how dangerous of an area he lives in, and he decided that he wanted to legally purchase a gun to protect himself, and it was rejected by that same process you're talking about. And it stemmed, we had tried to do a little work for him, and it stemmed from a loitering arrest he had when he was 17 years old. That's the only contact he's had with the criminal legal system. And at 40 years old, he can't protect himself. And again, I'm not a gun person. I'm not a person that thinks that guns make us safer. I think they don't make us safer. I think they make domestic violence more deadly and average conflicts more deadly. But with that said, if he decides that, I just got to go protect my family, and he carries a gun and he gets pulled over, well, now he's got a felony in his background. And how does that make his life better? How does that make our community safer? I would submit again that it would make our community less safe, right? By taking away his ability to provide for his family or taking away his freedom. So I think we have to think holistically about what our responses are. And quite frankly, I think there are lots of people that are trying to do the right thing, but we are so ingrained with this idea that prison bars and prosecutions will make us safe. When in reality, if you go into communities, I don't think you'll walk around and say, oh man, all this community needs is 3 more police officers. Oh man, all this community needs is 8 more people who are on probation. Oh man, all this community needs is 18 more young people doing 3 years in prison and coming back unprepared to continue to help their family. We have to think about how we're making communities better. I don't think that we're doing a good job.
So we have a couple more questions from the audience connecting to both what Sharone and Sheila have said. So let me just get back to this gang database question, and there's a follow-up question for Sheila. You mentioned the way that the definition of gang member is flawed and the way that this database was riddled with errors. Is this the database, and are those the same definitions that would be used for this new civil asset seizure law that the mayor is supporting?
The definition for who can be sued under the mayor's proposal is actually even broader. Under the mayor's proposal, you do not have to be somebody who the Chicago Police Department has designated as a gang member. Instead, you need to be somebody who the Chicago Police Department has merely decided has provided aid to a gang member in furtherance of some kind of gang activity. So it really widely expands the pool of folks who could be targeted under this statute. I think that both Sharone and I have a similar conception that it could include grandmothers who are allowing people to stay at their home or using their cars. So it's sort of kind of really busted past the definitional requirements of a gang member that are in state law and really expanded this community-wide. And I think that is one of the things that's most terrifying about the mayor's proposal, is that it really would allow entire communities to be targeted for civil lawsuits.
And I think it's so attractive. I said I was going to be quiet. That was like 8 comments ago. So yeah, sorry. They talk about how, this is for kingpins. This is for kingpins. These are for the people that are driving the violence. And I would argue that even if we take folks at their word, which we should, what about this this ordinance limits things to kingpins? Even if we thought that was the right approach, right? The way it's so broad that it can target anybody. So let's say, for instance, this administration decided that they were going to be equitable and judicious in the way they pursue these actions. There's nothing stopping the next administration, right, who may not be as equity focused, from destroying communities through the use of civil asset forfeiture, which progressive communities like DuPage County abandoned in 2010. Right? We got to do better. We got to do better. I think people have their hearts in the right place, and there are things that we can talk about that I think have been steps in the right direction. But this ain't it. Ain't it, Chief? Ain't it?
Can people find out whether or not they are in the gang database? Is that something that is searchable? Do you have to file a FOIA request? How would that work?
At this moment, it is not searchable. The way that you can find out if you're on the gang database is by submitting a FOIA request, or folks often find out that they're in the gang database when they're being prosecuted, and the prosecutor seeks some sort of gang enhancement. But there is otherwise, there's no way to know about it. It is a secret list that is used for law enforcement purposes. Folks also find out they're in the gang database when they've been placed in deportation proceedings. But otherwise, there's no way to find out about it, and there's also no way to challenge your designation.
Yeah.
Add one quick thing. I think it shocks people because they've never stopped to think of it, but it's actually not against the law to be in a gang. So I just want to point that out. Gangs, by the statutory definition, are groups that are committing unlawful activities, but it is a freedom of association issue to say that I am part of a group and I identify with that group. That is actually not an illegal activity. And one of the interesting things that we have in the state of Illinois is a statute on the books that says that if you possess a gun and you are a gang member, now, not using the gun for the furtherance of gang activity, like this ordinance or other ordinances that are targeting allegedly gangs do, but possessing a gun because of your inherent status, your association as a gang member, brings you a different set of criminal penalties than you otherwise might receive.
3 to 10, I think.
I think it's pretty outrageous that this is something that we tolerate. I also think
So both of them are legal. Having a gun is legal, and being in a gang is legal. But
well, having one unlawful, I should say,
Okay,
having
so-
having an unlawfully possessed one, but
having that
by
association.
virtue, yeah, but also doing that while being a gang member.
Okay.
I also want to raise really quickly, since I'm speaking out of turn here, I want to lift up some research that our students have done already this semester. Emma Silverstein and Josephine Bryan are new clinic students with us now, and they've looked into some of the legislative history of some of the gun penalties in Illinois. And they found this discussion in 1999 with Representative Art Turner Sr., who many of you know is a real, was a leader. He's not in the legislature anymore, but was a real leader in the Democratic caucus. And he said that he was opposing the increase of this gun penalty in 1999 because of selective enforcement, because of racial profiling, because 90% of the people who were being targeted with criminal sanctions and penalties were Black, and he said Hispanic at the time. We might say something else different. People in Chicago. He said that we're not getting any safer as a result of this intensive racial policing and criminalization, and so I don't think we should continue down this road. Representative Monique Davis, who many of you also might be familiar with, also said, why are we singling out one type of criminal activity, one type of criminal organization? This isn't about the mafia, and white people who own guns, white people who have criminal associations are not targeted in the same way. Why are we judging people by their tattoos and putting them into these databases and then increasing penalties for this reason? And what's interesting to me is that the legislative response at the time, in order to get these penalties passed, was, we're going to work on that. We're going to fix it next spring. We're going to get rid of this disparate policing. So you can come along with us on this bill and we can get it passed, and we're going to handle policing next year. So I guess that's spring of 2000. We fixed policing disproportionality in Illinois. Unfortunately, as we've seen over the last 20 years, it's only increased.
Well,
Can I say one more thing about this one? I'm sorry.
go ahead.
That's nighttime. It's funny you mentioned Art Turner Sr. because I was thinking Art Turner Sr. Something just happened. I think about a year ago, Art Turner Sr., who's I think 69 or 70 years old, was leaving his house when 2 unmarked CPD officers arrested him and handcuffed him to I think a bench for like 8 hours, right? So that stuff that he was predicting in 1999 happened to him last year, where he's leaving his community in a car, and apparently his car didn't have the right plates, right? This is a leader, like one of the titans of the House of Representatives, and he's handcuffed to a bench, and eventually an officer, I think, comes by and recognizes him as like a titan of the community and not the person they were looking for, who was, I think, 35 years younger than him. He wasn't lying, and it happened to him.
Okay, well, we are out of time, and I just want to thank all of our panelists. There was one more question left, but actually this is a great segue to do a little bit of shameless self-promotion. So there was a question about carjacking and how media narratives connect to charging for things like carjacking, which has strangely spiked since the start of the pandemic, and there's very interesting reasons why that might be happening. And actually, Stephanie and Rob Vargas, who was on the previous panel, have done a lot of interesting work on this issue. I wrote a story about it for the Reader a few months ago about how youth are being blamed for carjacking in Chicago, and it was a type of crime that was being really highlighted by local news to basically excuse a criminalization of youth, even as every other type of property crime was like way down since the start of the pandemic. So I encourage whoever asked that question to check out that work and to keep abreast of Rob and Stephanie's work. And just thank you all again for your work and for participating in this panel. And I'm Maya Dukmasova. I'm at Injustice Watch now, and you can check out our work at injusticewatch.org. We also have a weekly newsletter that you should sign up for. We only send it once a week. So thank you all for coming out. And our next panel, we get started at 2:45. And it'll be a discussion of solutions that can help Chicagoans to build peace. Thank you all.
Thank you.